Hi, everybody. My name is Richard.lesperance. I go by the name of my man Richard. Welcome to A Better Lifestyle. Today, I have the pleasure to have Aisha. I didn't want to mess up your last name, so how do you pronounce your name?
Aisha Jorge Massengill.
Great, perfect. So Aisha is doing some great works in the legal aspect, like in the law industry. So today we're going to be talking about employment law. So I think a lot of people are going to benefit and learn from that episode. So how did you get into that field, employment law?
First of all, thank you for having me here. A little bit by process of elimination. When I was what they call a summer associate, so like a summer intern, I took assignments from a lot of different areas of my firm, and I just felt a draw to employment law. Dealing with people is something that I feel like naturally drawn to. I always joke that I went to law school because they said there'd be no math, so I'm not drawn to anything that really involves a lot of numbers. But I love dealing with people and solving people-related issues.
Okay. What are the new changes in the employment law right now at the moment?
So, you mentioned you're in Canada. Here in the US, there's just so much going on with immigration, our immigration policy. So, I typically represent businesses, and how that can impact businesses is if you want to place someone on an H-1B visa and have them work for your organization, there's a big slowdown there. The more controversial issues in employment law have to do with the DEI executive orders, which really impacts how companies interact with their employees and how they continue to build an environment where they want inclusivity and a sense of belonging. There's this now legal overlay that people have been concerned with in the past, but there's some real heightened awareness coming out of the executive orders. And I would say even prior to that, a couple of years ago, there was a big Supreme Court case that came out that impacted how people look at DEI. So there's a big battle in the US about how do we still create cultures of belonging and diversity, now that some of those words have been made like bad words.
But when we talk about DEI, it's not only, well, correct me if I'm wrong because I'm following to what's happening to in the US. It's not only referring to like ethnic, like if you're Hispanic or if you're Asian. So talk because there's that big like I don't know if it's confusion,
Mhm.
misunderstanding because people are saying on one part they're saying it's like referred to like minorities, and on the other part is saying like if you're qualified to do the work. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you threw in that word qualified because you always have to start there. And one of the things that always troubles me about this conversation is there's a group of people who have kind of hijacked that word and they've made it to mean if you're interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion, that means you want to take a less quality, that as an employer, who I represent employers, you're making me take less qualified people in the name of diversity. And that's not it at all. And diversity isn't just um, your racial differences, your ethnic differences. It could be neurodivergence, right? You could be on the autism scale. It could be people who are differently abled, either physically or mentally. So it could be your different age groups, right? You want to have different mixes of generations in a particular workplace. So it can mean a lot of different things. It could be intellectual diversity, making sure that there's space for people to have conversations where they may not agree on like their outlook on a particular topic, but they're able to discuss it with decency and respect, and create pathways for people to talk about differences. So in the US, we've made it a little bit of a dirty word, but I just want to make sure that your listeners understand DEI doesn't mean that the quality of employee you're being asked to hire is less. That's absolutely untrue.
What are some common legal issues that are really popular that you face on a regular basis?
Sure. One thing is just how we pay people, there's a big thing of called misclassification, right? So particularly companies that are trying to build, they will hire people and call them independent contractors or consultants. Sometimes they do that because they don't want to have to pay into the tax system. And our taxing authorities, whether it be at the state level or the Internal Revenue Service, which is the federal level, they're very interested in making sure they get their tax money. And so when you misclassify someone and saying, "Oh, they're just an independent contractor," that creates challenges. And where I see it pop most frequently is you think you're working with someone. We agreed, we have a document that says, yes, you're an independent contractor. Say the assignment ends, that person goes and files for unemployment and they put your company's name down. And unemployment sends you a form. It says, hey, this employee has filed for unemployment compensation benefits. And you're like, they weren't my employee, they were a contractor. And so there becomes this battle. And then the government looks in and says, "Ooh, you've misclassified them. You should have been treating them as an employee. They should have gotten certain benefits. You should have been withholding taxes." And so when organizations get really pressed financially for money, a lot of times they want to make everybody contractors, and they simply are not. So that remains a topic of the day.
What are some, in regards to the employee side, what are some rights that they overlook that they're not aware of?
So you're generally there's something called being at will, which means that an employer can let you go for any reason, but it can't be for an unlawful reason. So it can't be because you're over 40. It can't be because you're female. It can't be because you have a disability if you're qualified to do the job. And so those are things, and it can't be so those are in the US, those are what they call statutory rights, things that are written in the book of law, right? And then there's certain common law rights. Like if I feel like I am informing people about bad behavior that my company is participating in, that can be what's called a public policy exception. That you can't fire me because I said you were engaged in bad company behavior. That's retaliation. And retaliation can happen on the discrimination side, but it can happen what we call a whistleblower. So if you are blowing the whistle against the company for doing bad behavior, there are protections for you for coming forward because otherwise people would be too afraid to come forward and then the bad behavior would be allowed to continue.
So speaking, I was going to touch about that. Speaking about the whistleblower, there's a lot I see. There's a lot of that happening right now. So how does that work on both sides?
So typically, when you're working for a company, um, you have to have multiple avenues for somebody to complain, right? So most typically in a company, it's like, hey, we have an HR department. You can talk to HR, you can talk to your manager. And if you are really engaging in best practices as an employer, you also have anonymous ways to report. Because people naturally can't help themselves retaliate. If something that they feel was said unfairly about them, sometimes you just can't resist the temptation to then mistreat that person in return. And so we want to make sure that people have a way to complain and have those concerns looked into without fear of retaliation. And so that's why it's really important for companies to have anonymous hotlines that people can talk to. And then on the government side, um, the different government agencies have reporting mechanisms that you can reach out to those agencies and let them know that you've observed behavior that might be violating the law or other kinds of practices that companies shouldn't do. So, either on the private side or on the government side, there are ways for employees. And if you go to any government website, state or federal website, there's always some area for folks to look to see if they have a concern to report those.
So what would you say to someone who wants to, well, be a whistleblower? I'm trying to put it nicely, but is afraid of going and taking that step. What would you say to that person?
Um, it takes a certain amount of courage to do it. I don't sugarcoat that, right? Because especially with companies, you can do all the things possible to try to protect that person, but sometimes, information will leak out that shouldn't leak out. And so there's a risk there. And every company that's, trying to do the right thing will say, we will try to keep this as confidential as possible. We won't disclose unless absolutely necessary. But sometimes things leak out. And so it does take a certain level of courage and conviction. I would say you have to believe deeply that you're doing the right thing. And there's a certain level of trust that you should find the person within your organization that you trust, that you can disclose the information. The only caution I will give to employees is you can't tell somebody about a concern and then say, don't tell anybody. Because as an employer, once we hear it, we can't be a turtle. Like we can't put our heads back in the shell and pretend we didn't hear it. Because 6 months later, you'll say, I told Aisha and she didn't do anything about it. And Aisha says, well, you told me not to. So if you are an employee and you have a concern and you express that concern, you should expect that the company is going to take steps to address your concerns.
Is it in uh, is it legal for someone in let's say in the company if they record someone without their permission?
It depends. I know I hate giving that answer, but it's state rules. So there are states that are one party consent, and that means if I decide to record, as long as I'm consenting, I don't have to tell Richard. But there a lot of states are dual party consent, so it requires the consent of both of the parties. That being said, as an employer, you can have a rule that says you're not allowed to record meetings. And in fact, I've had cases where we've terminated employees when we've learned that they were recording without consent. So there's the law outside of a business that says, hey, if you want to do it, you can do it. But as a business owner, you still have certain rights to set rules of the road for how people behave once they start working for you. So you can have no record rules for folks.
So I'm gonna take it one step further, so if one person would record a situation and it's like they have proof of something that was wrong, like the company did wrong, would it pass in the court?
That gets complicated because if I am the attorney for the business, I'm going to say there's a thing called like fruits from the poisonous tree or something to that effect. That basically, if you got the information in a wrongful way, you don't then get to benefit from the use of that information. Now, at the company level, if you recorded I might say, you're getting disciplined because we have a rule against recording, but now we understand that something bad has happened. We're going to independently look into it ourselves and see if any action needs to be taken on the bad information that you're saying the person is doing. But that doesn't forgive you from violating the rule. So in court, it could be excluded. Fruits of the poisonous tree. If you go to court and you've done something illegal where it's like it's a dual party consent state, you recorded someone, you didn't give them the consent. Any lawyer worth their salt is going to file a motion to exclude that evidence so that you cannot benefit from it.
Uh, so what are some cases that you faced that you dealt with that you remember that was like pretty big or really like touch you or had an impact?
Um, One of the biggest, and I wouldn't necessarily call it cases, but I also do investigations. And because it kind of pulls together all of the things that you've been talking about so far, was when a secretary at a company that I worked for claimed sexual harassment against one of our executives. And by the time we finished the investigation, some 13 or 14 women had been impacted by this leader, but none of them had the courage that that 20-something-year-old secretary had to come forward. And had they had that courage, it might have been three. right? But it took her to do it. And the thing that always stuck with me was every witness that we talked to, they would kind of sigh and their shoulders would shrink. And then they would shake their head and they would say the name of the person to say, hey, I'm here to talk to you about a concern that's been raised about someone. And then, like, they were never surprised. And so that's the importance of people finding that courage because the company can't act unless it knows. But that was very impactful to me. One is you have to, as an organization, create the right pathways for people to feel comfortable coming forward. And you have to do the best that you can to protect them once they've come forward. I think we did a wonderful job of that. That leader was ultimately fired. But it took that young person to say something where 14 other women had been impacted and didn't.
So how do you work with your clients when there's a case presented?
So there's always kind of an intake process, right? So they raise an issue, and I try to gather as many facts as possible to understand. And um, there's like the common sense outcome, and then there's like what are the legal implications. So a lot of times people will come to me with an issue. It may actually not be a legal thing. People always say everything's legal. It's like, no, they were obnoxious, but that wasn't necessarily illegal. Or you may not have liked that particular activity, but that wasn't illegal. And so some of it is an intake process. You try to get to the heart of what the concerns are that are being raised, and then you take the legal analysis and you lay it on top of that, excuse me, and then you give them your assessment of like what the legal claims potentially are, what the likely outcomes may be. So again, I was having a conversation with someone today. We were talking about damages. So what's the nature of your harm? Even if everything you said was true, and the person did that behavior, how were you damaged? And if you can't prove you were damaged, there's not really a lot to do. There's no money there for you if you can't prove damages like you lost your job, so you lost your salary or you suffered some emotional distress and you had to treat with a psychologist because of it. Like there has to be damages that you've sustained as a result of the bad behavior from a legal perspective.
Is there do you see a lot of how can I say that in regards to remote work? Because I see, I'm not sure if on your side they're forcing people to go back to work. So how's that situation going with remote work?
Yeah, it's challenging, and that's one again on just the return to office. That's not so much legal because you know an employer can set the location of the work, and when folks went out, primarily for COVID, is with the understanding that hey, we have to do this because it's not safe for us all to gather together. What happened with employees is they said, look, I've shown that I can be just as productive being at home and working remotely as, being in the office. I have an old boss who used to say, no, we have data that shows that people are actually less productive. But it's really about how the business communicates with its employees. Do they give them kind of an on ramp to say, listen, we're not going to make you come back tomorrow, but in 3 months, you need to be prepared to come back. So, for example, if you have childcare issues, you need to resolve. If you have family care issues, you need to resolve. You have 3 months to start to get those things lined up, but we are going to come back into the office. For these huge companies, if you think about like JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon in New York City, they built a huge building in Manhattan that they're paying on. And so he's been one of the big people out front saying, no, I need people back in the office. And the other thing is that I'm a fan of hybrid, okay? Because I think that there is benefit in interpersonal, person to person connection and collaboration that you can't always get through the screen. But, I live in a major metropolitan area. The commutes are awful. There's so much time you lose commuting. And so I love like, hey, let's have a few days in the office where we're collaborating and then days where we're not, and I can get like more heads down work. But the employer can say, you need to come back in. The downside for them is some people may say, I only want a remote job now. But I think the remote jobs are not going to be as plentiful as they were during COVID.
What would be some rule of thumbs for both sides, for the employees and the employer?
In the context of the remote
Eh,
work,
no, the employment law, like the rights and everything, like do's and don'ts, or what they need to know.
um, I just think again, I don't know that this is the do's and don'ts are not necessarily legal. If you start with trying to be a decent human being with the other people that you come into contact with, that can solve a lot of issues. And also understanding that everyone doesn't hold your views. So you have to learn how to discuss things in a way that is respectful, that conveys your concerns, but that in the context of business keeps the business first. Because we come to work, to try to make sure that the business is successful. And so if you're respectful in your communications, if you all keep in mind that what's the mission? The mission is to make the business successful, and we're one team. So how can we work together as one team to make the business successful? Then you don't get as many of the spurs about like, this is my thing and this is why it's important to me and I'm going to have my way no matter what. If you keep like that one team focus and you're respectful, I think that that would help keep the temperature down in a lot of workplaces. But oftentimes it's like, no, it's my way or the highway. I want to do it this way. People yell and scream again, which is not illegal, but it just doesn't create an environment where people can be collaborative and be successful.
Where can people learn more about you or follow you?
Sure. So I am on all the socials. You can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram at sedgwickandrews.com. So SEDGWICK Andrews.com, which is the intersection of the two places in the Bronx, New York, where I grew up and learned how to play basketball and kind of like fight for myself as a little girl. And I try to bring that to my clients that I work with. So sedgwickandrews.com or topemployermistakes.com. You can also find me.